Ooh, another white boy with a podcast. Pronouns, Jim Bro. Another white boy with a podcast. You want to see the video? It went viral.
Hi Gains Gurus and welcome to TMGP, the Muscle Growth Podcast, episode 17. I am your host, Roscoe, and today we are welcoming Ben Yanes onto the show. Ben Yanes, known as the Modern Meathead, is a prominent figure in the fitness and lifting community. He hosts the popular Modern Meathead Experience podcast, where he shares his insights and expertise on various topics related to muscle growth and overall well-being. With a strong online presence on platforms like YouTube and Instagram, Ben has built a significant following and is frequently featured as a guest on other popular fitness podcasts, including the Key Nutrition Podcast and now the Muscle Growth Podcast. Ben has an excellent grasp on often overlooked key aspects of lifting and uses science and anatomy to create intelligent courses and communities for people who love to lift. In today's episode, we can look forward to insights from Ben related to anchoring and anchoring principles and fundamentals. What is it? Examples, tips, and tricks. Common fitness myths. Fear-mongering in fitness. Biomechanics. Injury prevention. Debunking functional training. Improving exercise selection. Exercise positioning. And principle-based logic using first principles. Hey Gains Gurus, before we dive into today's episode, we have a special shout out to our sponsor Heart and Mind SA. If you're looking for a delicious way to boost your workouts, their creatine gummies can be found on Takealot and are the perfect fit. They're not just effective, but also a tasty treat you can look forward to every day. So, fuel your gains with Heart and Mind SA, where your heart, mind, and muscles come together. Now, let's get back to building muscle with science. Welcome, Ben Yanes, to the Muscle Growth Podcast, where we explore subjects related to muscle science and hypertrophy. I'm thrilled to have you join us for today's conversation. Let's jump right in and dig into some exciting topics together. Can you briefly introduce yourself and your journey into the world of lifting?
Yeah, sure, man. And first of all, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. Happy to chat and honored that you'd ask. So in terms of my background, I started off lifting probably around the age of, I want to say 12, 13 years old. I'm 25 now, so a little bit more than a decade of formal and informal experience. And I originally started lifting, as many people do, just because they're playing sports. So I played football, I played baseball for pretty much my whole life, as long as I can remember. And so I had the typical athlete introduction to weightlifting, which was pretty informal in most ways. There was never really like a clear, degree of instruction in all the sports settings that I was in. But luckily enough, I had an older brother who sort of had a little bit of a background, or at least some experience in lifting. So he was kind of the one to introduce me to things. And, I never really stopped since that age, but I also never really had the chance to sort of dive super deeply into, the topics that I'm interested in now. I kind of just treated it as this secondary, thing as an aside from, the sports that I was playing. And eventually when I stopped playing sports, I became more interested in things like personal training, strength and conditioning coaching. Fast forwarding to college, I had an internship with a bunch of sports teams. So, I had the opportunity to coach a bunch of athletes at my school, athletes of all kinds. For a long time, I did powerlifting very informally. I was quite the novice powerlifter, but my introduction really to the topic specifically that you likely associate me with, which is biomechanics and exercise mechanics, began as a consequence of repeated injury. And I think many people find themselves in that position, when they're lifting, at least the non-genetically elite, the non-genetically gifted folks out there. And so I started, diving into biomechanics in my later years of lifting, closer to my late teens, when I was in college and late high school. And so I sort of found a passion or an interest in biomechanics because of the ways in which it was able to sort of help me navigate injury and navigate the gym. And so fast forwarding to now, all these years later, I basically work with personal trainers, I work with coaches, and I work with the average gym bro, if you will, the average gym broette, in better understanding these things for themselves so that they can either, apply to their clients or apply to themselves directly. But, from start to finish, that's pretty much the elevator pitch. Failed athlete, got hurt a bunch, learned a lot of stuff so that I didn't keep getting hurt. And here we are.
Well, fantastic. And I'm glad that you're here. So what were those sports that you did growing up?
I played American football and I played from age, I want to say 7 until 18, so a good 11 years of contact football, which is a little bit crazy to think about the fact that I started playing contact football at 7. Nevertheless, football accompanied by baseball for the most part. So most people are probably familiar with what baseball is, but those are my main 2 sports. I also dabbled in wrestling, basketball, informal golf, swimming, a bunch of other things. But, my main 2 sports were baseball and football for most of my youth.
And football, especially American football, has very high impact and big injury rates, I'm sure. Very high.
Yeah.
What was your worst injury from both football and from baseball? How did they compare?
Well, it's funny because I think from the perspective of like acute trauma, the injury that I had in baseball was worse than the injuries that I ever had in football. And what I mean by that is my worst injury in baseball was I basically snapped off half of my ring finger. And you can kind of see it like here, like it's still sort of the top portion of this finger bends like weirdly hyperextending backwards this way. And that was basically just from, missing a fly ball. I basically flexed or I extended my right elbow out a little bit too far when I was trying to catch something. The ball basically whiffed my glove and took off half of my ring finger. But luckily it was not entirely detached. They could just stitch it back on and it was no problem. That was the worst in baseball. So nothing really, was more dramatic or long-term than that. But in football, I would say the most painful injury that I had, and this was one that persisted my entire career, was just constant shoulder subluxation. And for those that don't know what subluxation is, it's not quite dislocation, but it's basically this term to describe the idea of the head of the upper arm sort of shifting out of the socket of the scapula and sort of back in a very short period of time. So it's basically like a really, you can think of it as like a really powerful stretching and sort of relaxation of the tendons of the shoulder. And basically what that manifested in was like a very brief dislocation, a loss of sensation, and then a rapid return to play within like 5 minutes. So what would happen was, and this happened to both my shoulders, by the way, because I also played quarterback, so I was throwing the ball a lot. And so my shoulders would basically dislocate or subluxate. I would come off the field in tremendous amounts of pain or numbness. And then within about 10 minutes, the sensation would return and I would be able to go back and play. So in a weird sense, the football injuries were worse, although they were less acutely traumatic. They were just so chronic that they just extended forever. And, it's likely that all of that played a role in my, injury resilience or lack thereof, at least relative to most people, because shoulder injuries were basically all that I had leading into, the informal powerlifting and the lifting alike.
Do you still do any powerlifting or anything like that?
I don't. I mean, at least I haven't in probably a good 3 to 4 years now. The last time that I formally performed a barbell bench press was probably 3 or 4 years ago. Not out of like distrust or dislike or anything like that for the motions, but I just did them for so long that I got sick of them, and I got sick of navigating the progression on them, just because I found that, and this is typical for, I think, many powerlifters and people in general, is I had to kind of let go of powerlifting to let go of an attachment to certain numbers, like lifting certain amounts of load, that was something that I felt like, in retrospect, really held me back in a lot of ways, just not intelligently progressing, constantly trying to, do more than I should have tried to do, which is, it's kind of just a part of the human condition. But I'll still do things that are sort of deadlift equivalents, RDLs, motions that are similar to those barbell related motions. But I've stayed away from the formal lifts for about 3 to 4 years now, just because of enjoyment factors.
Do you think that maybe one day you'll get back into those 3 big lifts, or maybe not?
It's a good question, because I think that the answer is yes, because I've thought about this before. I do think that eventually I will become bored with all the things that I'm doing now, and purely out of the sake of novelty, perhaps a midlife crisis, I will return to powerlifting at some point when I find that my eagerness to lift has decreased, and maybe I'll do it in a way which is more integrated. Maybe I won't go like totally balls deep. I'll just go like a little bit in that direction. But I do think that at some point I will encounter an existential crisis, which will drive me back toward powerlifting. Yes.
I get you. Well, I hope that it doesn't require a life crisis to do that. But I do hope to see you back on the platform at some stage. What were your best numbers?
So in pounds, and again, keep in mind, these were all gym related, so not formal powerlifting competition, which for those people who are not really power lifters, it doesn't seem like a big distinction, but it probably is a big distinction. That the settings are very different. The rules are very different. So my best squat in pounds was 565. My best, and that was low bar. My best bench press paused was 375, again in pounds. And then my best deadlift was 605, although that was with straps.
Those are very impressive lifts. And at what weight?
Yeah, and I did most of those lifts between about 185 and 195 pounds body weight. So I was like reasonably strong, I would say.
That's very strong. I'd say more than reasonable. That's probably,
yeah. And I would actually say the number that I was most proud of, and this was, and I do have a video evidence of this. Okay, so maybe I'll post it if there are questions. My strongest feat, I would say, of powerlifting was my 225 bench press record, and I think I managed 22 reps at like full lock, but it was a touch and go scenario.
Yeah, of course.
I am one of those people who has an unusually mobile thoracic spine and lumbar spine from the perspective of creating spinal extension. So I'm one of those people who can sort of fold themselves up into a little bit of a pretzel. So, normal people would look at it and be like, that doesn't count. But under powerlifting rules, it certainly did. And so it counts in my head, which is what matters.
Exactly. That's the only perspective that matters. In terms of that spinal flexion, so you mean you don't have a spine like a pig?
No, I don't. No. Well, at least not insofar as I'm aware. I've never had an MRI or X-ray done on my spine, so I can't be positive, but I can be reasonably sure that I do not have a pig spine.
Do you know the kind of meme that I'm referring to with what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. And, I do think that we should leave it at that, which is that it is a meme and that it can be, I think, extrapolated out to create false perspectives on like what that research is actually good for and what it tells us. And for those who are not particularly familiar, you're referring to a study in which pig spines were repeatedly manipulated past normal physiological ranges to, prove certain things, conclude certain things about disc health and its relationship to spinal forces. But I do think that from the perspective of actually understanding spines, that is a study that could be considered a seminal study just from the perspective of understanding the spine as a whole, because we don't really have the opportunity to do that with human spines, even in cadaver-based settings. I'm yet to see a study which would do something similar in terms of like extracting a human spine out of a body. That would be much more of a difficult process than a pig spine.
No, absolutely. But it's like the likes of Squat University and those kind of fear-mongering. There's a lot of fear-mongering in the fitness community that basically says that if you bend your spine, you're going to break your spine automatically. It just is. It's just how it is. Like spinal flexion and things are it's going to kill you. It's going to break your spine. Even chiropractors and things, they're very against lifting, which is strange. Not all of them, obviously, but a lot of doctors, a lot of medical professionals think that lifting is going to injure you, which it probably will. But you could also get injured slipping in the shower. So it's like, yeah. What's your opinion on lifting and strength being fantastic for injury prevention? How do you feel about that statement?
Yeah, so I mean, the concept of injury prevention, just to sort of nip it in the bud first off, is it's a little bit of a misnomer, right? Because, it's not as if we can see into the future and predict injury and be able to sort of prevent injury as it might arrive. It's more like what we mean to say is how can we be more resilient and how can we lower the potential ramifications of engaging in physical activity? Because just like you said, to your point, any physical activity has some degree of risk associated with it, right? And lifting is no different, but relative to all of the injury related data that we have in terms of, sports specific related injuries, like at least again, insofar as the data that we do have, lifting is fairly like low risk relative to most activities, especially sports like plyometrics related sporting activities. So from a relative standpoint, injury is very, low risk, but that doesn't mean that it's zero risk. And there are plenty of people who will take that little snippet of information and sort of use it to justify all manner of like crazy exercise selections and potentially nonsensical exercise selections and executions. So I think that's just the first point to be made. The next point to be made is just that I generally take the perspective that injury is really this consequence of overall. Of course, we could refer to specific stresses, specific kinds of forces, and we could try to sort of mathematically model those forces out to say, this is more dangerous than that. But at the end of the day, every position should sort of be taken within the context of itself, right? So you mentioned like spinal bending, right? And people fearing spinal bending. Spinal bending, much like bending your elbow, is not something that we should consider as a good or a bad thing. It simply is just a description of relationships between bones and how joints move, right? And so much in the same way that bending your elbow can't necessarily be injurious or not injurious, right? It's like how we actually manage the position and then our exposure to the forces within that position that will determine whether or not we have an outcome that we want or whether or not we have an outcome, that we don't want. So when it comes to injury, I look at this sort of more as an equation of preparation and more as a conversation around how prepared are we for particular activities. And if you are completely unprepared for an activity, a good example that I hear very often is when people will say something like, I haven't played basketball in 10 years and I went out to play with my boys and, I tore my Achilles or I rolled my ankle, right? And therefore basketball, is looked at as this dangerous thing in the eyes of that person, right? Rather than taking the more reasonable perspective, or what I think is the more reasonable perspective, which is, hey, I was clearly not prepared to handle the amount that I did in the time frame that I did it in. And so regardless of the activity, the position, the force description, the loading scenario, I think that it all ultimately comes back to that fundamental, premise of, okay, injury is just moving beyond a certain point of my capacity to tolerate. And that can happen in any scenario. It can literally happen, bending over to pick up a pencil. It could happen, standing up from, or getting out of a pool, right? It doesn't matter what the activity is. And so, there are many more layers to that conversation in terms of like what leads people to maybe injure themselves when they're picking up a pencil. Clearly, like people who can deadlift, hundreds and hundreds of pounds don't necessarily think that they might get hurt picking up a pencil, but that's because that there are a lot of inputs into the system that you can't necessarily see or take into account just in that sort of isolated incident. So, the takeaway there just being, injury is a matter of how prepared we are for something. And then number two, we have to consider all the things that surround that particular injury and the context of the stress around that injury to actually have like a clear picture on how we can make sort of reasonable choices in the gym and then also sort of outside the gym alike.
Exactly. And you make a great point about being prepared and about and being reasonable. And I think that that's one of the main reasons probably that a lot of doctors and chiropractors strongly, or at least in my experience, strongly recommend not lifting heavy is because that they've seen a lot of injuries from lifting heavy, and a lot of those injuries were probably from people that weren't prepared to lift heavy, and then they went and lifted heavy and got injured, and then they said, well, therefore lifting heavy is bad. And that's kind of the extrapolation that they got to from all these injuries that happened from all these people that said they were lifting too heavy, and they probably were lifting too heavy for them. Doesn't mean that they were lifting too heavy for someone like, are you familiar with Andre Smarth? I think
I'm not. I'm not. No.
Look him up. He's a phenom. He's got the heaviest pull up in the world. Like he adds like 150 kilograms to his pull up for reps, which is insane.
What's his body? What's his body weight?
100 pounds. No, he's a absolute
oh my god
unit. You must check him out. He's really he's next. So he did 200 kilogram bench press for like reps.
Yeah, crazy. Yeah, and the other thing too, just to sort of piggyback off of a point that you made there, I think that like doctors and physical therapists, at least a lot of them in my experience, they will make these conclusions reasonably based off of their own experience, right? So like if you are a physical therapist or a doctor and you are frequently hearing people coming into your office saying, I was doing squats and I pushed my knees over my toes and I got hurt. If you hear 100 of those people come into your office, right, and say the same thing, it is a completely reasonable takeaway as that doctor to say, hey, this is something that is dangerous. But that is what we call a selection bias,
yes,
right? Which is kind of like saying, every time that I go for a walk outside of my apartment, I see this guy running, right? So there's this old guy who's probably like in his 70s or 80s, who whenever I go on walks, like in the morning, I see him going for a jog. It would be like me concluding that person is always jogging all the time, 100% of the time, even when I'm inside, because the only time that I see him is when I'm going on a walk and he's running, right? It would be like me, walking into the hallway, seeing someone sweeping, and every time then, I see that person, they happen to be sweeping, then I assume that they're doing that all the time. So I understand why these things are concluded on a general sort of blanket level, but I think it's just important to understand that so much of the conclusions that we have about the experiences that we're involved in are based on what our exposure to those things is and who they're related to. And so I think that, much in the same way that someone might conclude knee over toe is bad, right? What you didn't see was all of the people who did that exact same squat, that exact same way for 10 years and who also didn't get hurt. Or better yet, you didn't see all the times that person who came into your office, did that squat in that particular way for that many years and also, didn't get hurt. It was just the one time that they happened to do this that they, incurred an injury. So that's just like an example, I think, to illustrate my earlier points around like some additional context. It's like where, it's a conversation not just of where is someone right now, but where have they been and what is the data and what is the evidence that, we can draw from, not just based off of this one incident, but on all the prior data and the entire sort of timeline of their experience lifting.
Absolutely. And you make some amazing analogies, which is just fantastic. That's a perfect analogy right there. So just to reiterate that fact, guys, if your knees go over your toes naturally, that's fine. But if it feels good, that's probably the best kind of squat technique for you. If it feels good, that's probably going to be good. Or get a coach and they can decide for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think another thing too to consider is that what might be good for you now, may not be good for you in 5 years. And I think that's okay. And I think that's a normal part of the process, right? Like when people get stronger, their technique more than likely will change. And just being sort of willing to accept the fact that things can change and inevitably will change over time, I think is another thing to contribute to this process of, injury risk mitigation or injury risk reduction, right? Is just being able to sort of see the forest, not just for a single tree. It's to be able to observe sort of what works well for you as a sort of iteration over time and not just in a particular, scenario.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you about being willing to change your program, being willing to change your technique. Those are all things that come with time. And I think a lot of people are scared to change. And then some people have the opposite problem where they change every week, which is maybe also not not optimal for getting those benefits of lifting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of people will find benefits and may adhere better to programs where they are a little bit more willing to give themselves a squishy structure, if you will, a structure that is capable of adapting with their desires and enjoyments. But I certainly agree that sort of a program and an effective program is really what you're able to sort of repeat and sustain for long periods of time.
Absolutely. Well, on that topic of exercise selection, I saw today you posted a video about a guy doing push-ups, and in the push-up video he basically said if you flare your elbows out, you're going to get an injury, and so it's guaranteed. No matter who you are or your body mechanics or biomechanics or anything, if you flare your elbows out like at 90 degrees, you're going to get an injury. Therefore, do a 45-degree angle or something. He said. What are you? And I saw your take on that. Do you mind just elaborating on that and maybe extrapolating that kind of scenario to lifting in general?
Yeah, for sure. So, just to sort of speak more generally, I think that those kinds of pieces of content do well on social media because they present very simple stories and simple solutions to inherently very complex problems, right? So people are drawn to it. And the reality is that anyone who sees that piece of content who has injured themselves with a wider arm path feels very justified in what that person is saying. They're like, oh my God, this is my experience. Holy crap. This is my guru, right? And then everyone who has only experienced comfort with the wider arm path position will be like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? I literally only get pain when I do a push-up. The way that he's saying is good, right? And to me, that is like proof enough in the pudding of just how complex these things are. And not only that, just how, for a single person, how that, as we were just discussing, how that can change for someone over time, right? So I am someone personally who historically used to injure my shoulders only when I was using wider grip bench presses, right? But over the years, as I have exposed myself more and more to those positions that I maybe wasn't as well adapted to or wasn't as used to, I have seen a tremendous reduction of injury in that position to, now at this point, 0 injuries in that position over the last 5 years or 6 years, simply because I was willing to sort of expose myself to that position that I had maybe prior injury exposing myself to within. So, for me, it's kind of just this, I think the principle-based takeaway from that conversation and from any conversation which is similar, we see the same thing, with knees over toes. We see the same thing with rounded spines and deadlifts or hinge-based motions. I think ultimately you can all sort of, you can trace all these conversations back to that fundamental principle of, what is your level of preparedness for the activity, rather than saying that in absolute now and forever for anyone, whoever exercises, this thing will be added and this thing will be good. It's just too convenient. It's too reductionistic. It's too oversimplified to be useful. And it falls apart very quickly, even in my experience, in the people that are saying these things, because they'll say these things in one particular context where, for example, wide push-ups are bad, but then all of a sudden you see them on a different exercise doing a cable fly, in the exact same position. And all of a sudden, the same, it's sort of like a logic falls apart. It's not consistent, and sort of that's how you know that it's not really like a fundamental principle-based thing, is it's changing across scenarios. So I think the best takeaway from like a viewer perspective, excuse me, is anytime that you see strong claims like that made, like these false dichotomies, these really strong sort of X's and checks made, anytime you see that, you should at least just bring caution to your approach and how you interpret that information. And most of the time, whenever you see a sort of black and white absolute statement, you should choose to, not just discount the information, because it could be potentially useful for some people. And if you're a trainer, maybe some of your clients, but just to understand that it is reduced down to a very low resolution that often doesn't hold up in real practice, especially not over, like I said, sort of iterations over time for you, for your clients, or whoever you're working with.
Absolutely. So to sum that up, be very careful of fallacies and confirmation bias, especially black and white fallacies, where there's probably a whole spectrum of different gray, at least in terms of that. In terms of fundamental principles, I think one of the favorite content that some of my favorite content from yourself is anchoring. Let's chat about that. And I think anchoring is something that I've actually never really heard of too much, which is really surprising. And you were the first person to really bring me big into anchoring principles. And I would love if you could give like a kind of overview on anchoring, how you got into it, and some fundamental practices for anchoring.
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is that people have been using or applying these principles for a very long time, whether unconsciously or consciously, right? So like a good example is the first time that you go into the gym, you see a bench with a barbell and you lie down on the bench to do the barbell press, right? Now, most people, and this was my experience as well, you don't really think about like why you're lying down on a bench to do a bench press, right? But it becomes very obvious why you're lying down on a bench to do a bench press if you just simply imagine yourself to be doing a bench press without some sort of support behind your body, right? It would basically be like doing some sort of isometric acrobatic circus-based activity if you didn't actually have something behind you to sort of support you. So the principle of anchoring really came about as just a way to put into words a concept that people were already using and applying, just as a sort of more of like a catchy phrase that people could associate with something that was not lifting related, right? And everyone kind of, I think, maybe not everyone, but most people understand like what an anchor is in relationship to like something like a boat, right? Like if you're on a boat or if you're going fishing, you put something into the water or you attach the boat to some sort of buoy so that the boat, as you're doing activities, doesn't start to float away needlessly or doesn't start to move in directions that would otherwise require your attention, right? And so in the same way, an anchor that we can use in the gym is really just an immovable external object, right? Against which we can sort of, place our bodies, push our bodies, pull our bodies so that we can fix certain parts of our bodies and move other parts of our bodies. And this kind of connects to the fundamental principle of like motion. And I think this is something that is definitely under discussed, like in the broad lifting space, which is that if you are going to create motion anywhere, in my hands right now, as I'm speaking, in a bench press, as I'm doing a barbell press, the prerequisite for motion is somewhere else to not be moving, right? So for example, for me to be moving my arms all over the place here and my wrists all over the place to be talking, like my fingers can articulate and my wrists can articulate simply because my forearms are fixed in a position, my upper arms are fixed in a position, my upper arms are connected to my trunk, which is not moving, right? So in order to move any segment, I need for something else to not be moving, or else everything is moving simultaneously, or you're just falling through space and you're in a skydive, for example, like you're just free falling. So the fundamental principle is really like we utilize these anchors, these external objects in exercise so that we can move the bones that we want to be moving, to train the muscles that we want to train, and simultaneously so that we can fix or not move other bones that we don't want to be moving so that we don't train muscles that we're not trying to train. And just to give some concrete examples, a bench is an obvious example. To lie down on a bench and to do a bench press is to anchor yourself with that bench. To get under a thigh pad to do a lat pull down motion is to anchor your entire lower body and your entire trunk so that you can just perform the pull down. Sitting down on a leg extension to move the leg extension pad is a form of anchoring where you're in a seated position so that you can just isolate for motion at the shin and at the knee. Doing a seated leg curl, excuse me, so that you can, put a thigh pad down on your quads to be able to actually perform the leg curl. All these things are basically just different ways to say the same thing, which is we are using external things to limit motion so that we can create motion around the joints that we actually do want to train. And I do think that this is a lot more consequential than people realize in a lot of instances, mostly just because it sounds kind of obvious, but every part of our body is in some way connected to other parts of our body. Like we are one thing. And although there are many different systems within the body, whenever you impose force on a single section of the body, you are also imposing force elsewhere. There's no free lunch, so to speak, whenever you're moving something, right, in the weight room. So even, for example, if you're doing a standing dumbbell curl where it doesn't look like you're doing anything, the prerequisite to do a dumbbell curl is the fact that your feet are on the floor and that you're not going to fall through the floor when you initiate, the dumbbell curl upward. If you were standing on a very unstable surface, like a trampoline, for example, and you went to do a curl, your entire body would actually be moved downward, as you're doing that curl. And the weight would therefore be distributed not just to your biceps, but to all these other structures that could deal with it. So, the takeaway from that is basically that, anchors are just these objects that we use to restrict motion so that we can be more precise about our goals in the gym. And as a consequence, we can be more specific to the muscles that we're trying to train, the structures that we're trying to train, and then the motions that we're trying to train that are associated with those structures and with those muscles.
And on the anchoring, what can I give you examples of benefits that I could think of, as well as maybe some cons that I could also get your opinion on whether you think that there are real benefits and real cons to doing anchoring?
Yep.
So these are just like off the top of my head right now. I didn't give it too much thought, so please tell me if I'm completely off track.
Okay.
So benefits or pros: more focused on a specific muscle. For example, if you're doing a bicep, maybe a Scott curl, then it's got the pad or preacher curl. Then it's more focused on the actual bicep rather than your whole body kind of trying to stabilize it. And then maybe, again, like you said, this could go back to the preparedness, maybe less risk of injury, especially other muscles. I think maybe it decreases the risk of injuring a different muscle since you're more focused on the specific muscle. And then in terms of cons, maybe it's not as functional as everyday life, and then maybe there's less use of stabilizing muscles that again might consequentially mean it's less functional. What are your thoughts on those benefits and cons?
So benefits, I would absolutely say, the number one is basically just our ability, and I'm agreeing with this, is our ability just to be specific to a tissue or a group of tissues, right? Because it's not always necessarily one.
Yeah.
It could be a whole subsection. In terms of benefits related to injury risk or risk reduction, I would just refer back to our earlier conversation about, I wouldn't necessarily say it makes you less injury prone. It's more just like it changes the forces of the exercise so that, as we mentioned, the forces can be more precise to what you're trying to do. Whether or not that impacts injury relates more to your preparedness for that activity as opposed to the fact that you're doing something different. But what I would say on that note is that because these things are, or these anchored variations are more precise or can be more precise, generally speaking, their technique or the technique that you use with an anchored exercise is a lot easier to standardize, right? Because you're dealing with fewer moving parts. There's lower amounts of coordination that you need to deal with, and so other tissues, as a product of bones being restricted, literally do not have the ability to contribute, right? So a good example of this would be like if you were doing a lat pull down, right? A lot of people on a lat pull down, or maybe a better example, a more clear example would be like doing some kind of row. Like if you looked at like the bent over row versus a chest supported row, it would be a lot easier to standardize a rowing motion with a chest support because you don't have to actually start to manage motion through your spine or your hips. Whereas in a bent over row, it's like as soon as your back tissues start to fatigue, right, your pulling muscles start to fatigue, you can start to sort of cheat the motion a little bit more easily, right? With your spinal extensors, you can start to bend your knees more to launch the weight. So I would say that it leads to an easier ability to actually teach something, especially in my experience, people who are less advanced lifters have a much easier time learning motions when they're more constrained and more stabilized. And then as to the potential cons, 100%, I see the argument to be made about, the potential for what we would describe or what most people would describe as like less functional, fewer stabilizer muscles contributing. But what I would say is that mostly needs to come down to the conversation around like what functional is and why in the first place we're comparing, lifting weights to any sort of daily task, right? So, for example, If you were doing a pull down motion with a thigh pad that was holding you down, all that the thigh pad is doing is restricting your body from flying all over the place, right? So in essence, what that is doing for you is it's just allowing you to train your pulling tissues to a greater extent than it is like, let's say, your hip flexors, or just the fact that your body weight may be suspending upward and downward, right? And sort of contributing to that motion. So, the pull down, which is like sort of partially anchored or not anchored at all, you may argue that that could just turn into a pull up, right? Which would be, in some ways, it would be fine. But let's imagine that you're doing like a half pull down type of motion where you're not really secured by the pad, and then your body weight is sort of going upward and downward. That's just a less effective or less precise version of the thing that you were trying to do. And so most of the time, I don't find that the whole functional, stability thing applies if you sort of see that line of thought through to its logical end, because most of the time what's happening between these anchored and non-anchored variations is the non-anchored variations tend to just create rate limiters, which are not associated with the actual goal of the exercise. So to use the bent over row example, if your goal with the bent over row is to train your spinal extensors and your lats and your upper back, your traps, all those things, but then all of a sudden you start to launch the weight with your quads or launch the weight with your glutes, you're just moving away from the goal. It's not like you're getting more and more equals more. It's like more in this case equals less for what you're trying to do. So in some sense, you could make the argument that per the lifting related goal, it's actually less functional for the goal. But that doesn't always mean that using more external objects is appropriate for the goal. So for example, if you were doing a row, like a chest supported row, like I mentioned earlier, versus a bent over row, and your goals were related to trying to target the lats, the upper back, the erectors, the glutes, and the quads to some extent, then the bent over row accomplishes all those things, whereas the chest supported row is a little bit more specific, but it doesn't train the spinal extensors to the same extent, and it doesn't challenge your ability of your hip extensors and your quads to any meaningful degree, right? And so in one instance, right, you are accomplishing the goal that you're trying to. In another instance, you may just be sort of accomplishing most of the goal, but then there are all these other associated rate limiters. So to me, whether or not something is functional is based upon what you're trying to do. And many people who have the goal of, training function, whatever the hell that means, are just not really being specific enough or precise enough about what they're trying to do. And so in their minds, it's kind of like, oh, well, if I'm doing more, then more is more and more is better. And what I would say is more is not better if it's not associated with the end sort of outcome, right? And so then the sort of final piece to that, and these two things are closely related, is the argument around like stabilizer muscles. And to be honest, to me, this conversation of stability from a joint perspective and from a muscular perspective really, I think, is confusing to people, because it's very difficult sometimes for people to understand how joint stability actually works and how joint stability actually functions. So for example, what would a good example be? So a good example of like a shoulder stability exercise that people do is a kettlebell bottoms up press, where the kettlebell is actually upside down. So the kettlebell is like up here, the handle is here, and people are like, balancing the kettlebell over top of their forearm and elbow, versus, let's say, a traditional dumbbell press where the dumbbell is just in your hand. People will make the argument, right, that the kettlebell bottoms up under press is more challenging to stabilizers, without actually specifying like what stabilizers they're talking about. Because from a force analysis perspective, the only thing that really needs to work harder in the kettlebell bottoms up under press are the tissues in the wrist, the forearm, and the hand, right, as compared to the tissues in the shoulder. Because if you looked at someone doing a dumbbell press, what you would see is a lot of stability through the hand, no challenge to any of the forearm, wrist muscles, right, and the finger muscles. What you would see is a lot of stress applied to the shoulder and then potentially the elbow. And if a lot of stress is applied to the shoulder and applied to the elbow, then all of the muscles that stabilize the shoulder have to work harder, and all of the muscles that work to stabilize the wrist have to work less hard. So again, this comes back to just, what are you trying to do? If you're doing a kettlebell bottoms up under press, are you doing it to train your shoulder stabilizers? Because if you were doing it to train your shoulder stabilizers, then doing something that would actually load your shoulder proportionately more would actually be the thing in a more stable environment that would do that. And so the point of clarity there around stability and stabilizers is that stability inside of the body is just synonymous with contraction. And anytime that we are in a potentially more anchored scenario, the contraction response to that more stable scenario has to be, or is required to be, higher than if we are encountering other rate limiters, like we're falling off balance in a squat, or our wrists are sort of, turning left and right as we're trying to do the press. So, fundamentally, that concept of functionality and stability is just, as a general discussion that people have, it's too broad, it's too vague. And then as soon as that conversation whittles down to a more specific context, that whole argument around, an anchored variation being less functional just starts to fall apart, right? Because it always needs to be relative or defined by what ultimately you're trying to accomplish with that thing. So did all those threads sort of make sense, or can I clarify any of the points there individually?
No, they all make sense to me. Hopefully that makes sense to the listeners too. I like the way that you bring things down like a big scope, and you make a very specific scope that is more definable. I think that's an excellent way to do things. And so ultimately...
And can I just add one more example that might provide clarity here too? A good example. So I get this one a lot just in response to things that I post. So take the example of like a face away curl. Otherwise, I think it's people refer to Bayesian or Bayesian curl. Yeah, something like that. And they'll say like, okay, well, if you do the regular curl where you're sort of stepped out in front of the cable stack versus, an anchored variation where maybe you have a pad behind your arm, right, to prevent your shoulder from having to do a lot of work. So compare those two variations, right? The Bayesian curl where we have our support, and then the version where we don't. In the version where nothing is behind the upper arm, okay, let's assume that we're standing far in front of the cable stack, so the cable is angled like 90 degrees backward from the arm. There is twice the amount of force on the shoulder in that particular case as the elbow. Why? Because the shoulder is twice the distance from the cable as the elbow is, right? So the question then becomes, are you trying to do a shoulder exercise? Are you trying to load your anterior delts, your pecs with a curl? Or are you trying to challenge your biceps and your brachialis and your brachioradialis, right? And people usually will conclude like, no, I'm trying to challenge like my biceps. So then my question becomes, why would you be doing an exercise which doubles the force, really doubles the torque on a non-target joint or a non-target muscle group, right? And then there's also the consideration of the fact that no exercise exists in an isolated setting. Like no exercise exists in a vacuum. And so what that means is that even if you're not checking the box of challenging shoulder stuff with the curl, you can simply do a front raise, at some other point in your program, or, a lateral raise, or a chest press, or an incline press, right? There are all these other things that people are already doing. And then to try to just accomplish, 3 different goals with the same exercise usually just means that people are accomplishing nothing sort of all at the same time. So that face away curl is a good example because it's one that I see a lot where people's curls end up turning into like front raise motions instead of like biceps exercises. And maybe that is a particular experience that people are familiar with. Just in terms of the physical sensations and the differences that people feel, in the anchored variation versus the non-anchored variation. So, that's sort of the principle-based takeaway. But I would also say that, more anchoring is not necessarily like better. A lot of people will just try to touch their body with more stuff like arbitrarily. It always just needs to be specific to what you're actually trying to do. And so it's not that more is better. In some cases, less can be better, especially when the goal is specified to a greater degree. But that's kind of the 30,000 foot, overview of anchoring.
Absolutely. So to bring it all back, make your exercise selection goal focused. For example, if you want to train your biceps, do it in such a way that your arm is anchored, that you can easily do a bicep curl rather than having to focus on stretching a whole bunch of other muscle groups that might not even be related to growing your bicep.
Right. It's like set an aim and then base what you do off of that aim, like work backwards from the aim, right?
Absolutely. Would you call that first principles?
Sure.
Really?
First principle of knowing what the fuck you're trying to do and then working backwards from there. Yes.
There we go. Make your exercise selection smart, I guess.
Sure.
More difficult than it seems. So finishing off anchoring, do you have any further examples and or tips and tricks?
It's difficult on a specific level because it is so exercise specific.
It is.
But most of it just comes back to understanding like what the desired motions are in an exercise and then what the undesired motions are. And most people can work backward from there, right? So let's just use a different example instead of like a curling example. Let's say something like a seated leg curl. I challenge anyone listening to this podcast to do a set of seated leg curls where you anchor the pad down on your thighs, count your reps, count the load, do as many as you can, and then just, take enough rest to where you're not really feeling the fatigue of that first set, and then do a set where you're not using the pad and just see if you can get a single rep, because I guarantee that unless you're doing like 50 reps on the first set, right? If you're doing between like 8 and 12 or 15 hard reps, that it will be unlikely that you will be able to perform a single rep of that seated leg curl if the pad is actually not on your thighs, right? And so in that particular case, it's like the motion you are trying to create is knee bending, and the motion that you are trying not to create is hip bending or spinal bending. And so what removing the pad does is it allows your hip to start to move upward, right? And if the pad is twice the distance to your hip as it is to your knee, then your hip is going to be the thing that lifts instead of your knee actually pushing the pad downward. So it's like step one, identify what motion you're trying to create. Step two, identify what motions you're trying not to create, and then set up some kind of external immovable object to prevent you from moving in the ways which you don't want to move.
Absolutely. And I think you made an excellent point about that I actually hadn't thought of myself, is about, for example, on the bench press, you mentioned how anchoring is already built in. Same with maybe a lot of machine-based exercise, like the anchoring, like for like the thigh pad on the lat pull down, it's already there. You don't have to think too much and overcomplicate it. It's already there. It's maybe more for maybe dumbbell or barbell exercises or cable-based exercise where you got to start thinking of the different biomechanics at play.
Exactly. And that's a really good point to be made, which is that most machines have been built a particular way. And the question is, well, why is this thing built the way that it is, right? Like, it sounds kind of stupid, right? But why does a leg extension machine have a back pad? It's like, why, again, it sounds kind of silly for most people to ask themselves this question, but why does a leg extension machine have a back pad that you rest your back on, right? It's so that you don't have to hold your spine up in space as you're doing the exercise, right? And so, like you're saying, so many of these things are built in and sort of baked into the cake. And I think it's very easy for people to take it for granted because you don't have to understand it in a lot of cases. Like you're saying, like with using machines, you don't have to understand, why there's a thigh pad. But, as an exercise for fun for most people to try is like, see what happens, when you don't use the things that are there for you to use. Like there's a very clear reason, why those thigh pads are there or why those back rests are there to begin with.
Absolutely. So let's go through some. Do you have any common fitness myths that you'd like to debunk on this podcast?
I mean, there are so many. I would say there's two major categories. The first category is one that we have kind of already discussed a little bit, which is related to the injury concept. Something that really gets my goat in general is the pathologization or the pathology that is created around very normal human motions and human positions. For example, the whole conversation around posture gives me a headache. The whole conversation around flared ribs, rounded shoulders, posterior tilt, anterior tilt, pronated feet, supinated feet, knees in, knees out. It's like all these things are just reductionistic claims about hyper-specific positions without context to a person, a population, a timeline, a force scenario, but there's nothing that is specific even to the slightest degree about most of these claims, that you can't even begin to break any of the claims apart without actually talking to a person, right? And every single time I talk to someone about a particular posture, like, oh, why is it good to have your shoulders, back and down, and why is it bad to have your shoulders rounded forward? most people will respond with something like, because it is, or, it was just like something it's a non-starter. So my number one fitness myth qualm is just pathologizing normal positions and positions to begin with, right? I think that's something that we really, as time goes on, I think we're all going to move away from as we start to better understand mechanisms of pain and injury and so forth. And it's not that there aren't important tidbits to be drawn from these kinds of things. But I just find that the conversation is too generalized almost 100% of the time to be useful to anyone and to be truthful really in any particular context. So that's number one, is just pathologizing basic human function. And then number two, and one more thing about that, which I just want to make clear is, it could, because some people may be skeptical in hearing me describe these things and my sort of stance against pathologizing these things. That all of these things are sort of self-defeating, because most people who have an opinion on one thing have a contradictory opinion on something that is very similar in principle. So for example, if someone has the stance that shoulders back and down is good, but that anterior pelvic tilt is bad, those two things occur in tandem with one another, meaning that if you take your shoulders back and down and you extend your spine, by definition, if you're, let's say, in a standing position or even in a seated position, you are moving into an anterior tilt, at least more so than you were if you were in a neutral or a posterior pelvic tilt, right? And so those two claims on some level are the same, and yet people have these contradictory opinions, right, in either case, which sort of conflict with themselves. So that's the biggest thing. I would say another thing of equal importance is just this framework around contraction, and specifically the concepts around like stability that we were sort of alluding to earlier. I think a lot of people view exercise as resistance with anatomy as a sort of secondary feature, right? So we look at bench press and we think about like bench press as the important thing, rather than what is happening to us as a consequence of the force of a bench press. So my framework here, and my maybe myth busting or sort of course correcting objective with this, is just to say that muscle contraction occurs as a response to the different kinds of resistance that we are imposing on our bodies. It is not random. It is not some sort of like arbitrary response. It is not something that is not predictable, at least in large part. It is something that, per the sort of fundamental principles of physics, is predictable, at least in a generalized sense, right? So I know that if I go to do a bench press, that my chest will contract, my front delts will contract, my triceps will contract. But the question is, why does that happen? And the answer is that it's because my muscles are responding to the external forces that I've imposed on it. So just sort of the overall framework being, I like to think about exercise as anatomy and anatomy's interaction with external force, rather than just prioritizing the shit out of the external force bit and sort of thinking that like the anatomy is something mystical or magical that can only be, guessed at in any given scenario. It's much more, I think, rooted in just understanding the relationship of tension and how tension relates to dealing with external forces. And so contraction as a framework for me is like, contraction is a response. It's not something that we like internally psychologically manifest just because we want to, right? It's like these things happen because we follow the same rules of physics that every other object in the world also follows. So I don't know if that last bit sort of makes sense, but just kind of viewing contraction as following the same principles that every other object in the universe, at least to our understanding, does. It's not something mythical, magical that we need to like really make into this, sort of nebulous, not understandable process.
Absolutely no, and I it makes sense to me. So I hope that it makes sense to the listeners. And what would the category 2 kind of fitness myths be?
So the first category was basically me talking about the pathologizing normal positions and normal motions, and then the second category was just trying to shift the framework around how we understand contraction to mean that contraction is a response to external force versus this thing that we just sort of magically create arbitrarily. So those are the sort of two categories, is just our framework around contraction and then our framework around injury and pathologizing particular postures and positions. Those are the main two.
So the first one being to be aware of cookie cutter programs, cookie cutter advice that's just the same, standardized for every single person, regardless of all the different factors that they have, and maybe being individual or person specific is far more useful to every individual.
Yeah, at least from the standpoint of, the discussion around things like posture and pain. Absolutely, yeah.
And maybe technique and things.
Yeah, for sure.
Fantastic. That was a very, very cool response that I really appreciate. Let's go over top 10 exercises. Okay, so the scenario. Imagine you're on a space mission to Mars, and due to limited memory space in your spacesuit's workout module, you can only select 10 exact exercises to maintain your muscle size. It can be any exercise, but you have to be specific with your instructions. For example, you can choose overhand wide grip pull-ups as a single exercise, and then close grip skull crushers on an easy bar as another exercise.
Yeah, so I'll just start by saying that from a principle-based standpoint, I would be remiss if I did not say that the framing of this kind of question, I think, is harmful to a lot of people from the perspective of their own ability to think about exercise. And what I mean by that is just, and I'll answer the question. Don't trust me, I'll answer the question. But I just mean that a lot of times when people answer this question, what the takeaway is like, oh, these are the exercises that I should do. And I'm simply just making a point of, this is kind of like saying that there could be 10 best foods for everyone for forever, right? This is like, no. These are the 10 foods that I prefer given the constraints of the scenario that you have created for me, okay? So that's the first thing that I'll say, but I will answer the question straightforwardly. So the first thing that I would say is I would probably pick a single arm pull down, okay? A single arm pull down, which is done, comfortably, doesn't have to be too narrow, too wide. Single arm pull down is probably one. Number two would probably be some kind of machine chest press. I'm just going to say machine chest press just because, there are a lot of different kinds, and I'll generalize that. But, I would like it to be some sort of machine converging chest press, however the machine is set up. There are a lot of different kinds, but from a principle-based standpoint, I think a machine converging is a great way to go. Then I would say some kind of cable lateral raise for the middle delts. I would say some kind of cable preacher curl, just because I love preacher curls and I think they're fun to do. I would say some kind of overhead triceps extension done with a cable. So that would be 5, and we've covered triceps, biceps, middle delts, chest, and lats. Then I would say some kind of chest supported row with a wide arm path for the upper back. Then I would say a leg extension for the quad. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then I would say some kind of 45-degree leg press for the glutes and the quads. So we have 8 now about. And then these last two, I think, would be, I would probably pick a seated calf raise because I love seated calf raises. People who don't understand research will be upset about me saying seated calf raise instead of standing calf raise, but I will make that claim nonetheless. And then the last box that we can fill, because we kind of covered most of the boxes, I'll probably say that I would pick a seated leg curl. So we got hamstring, calf, glute, and quad, another quad, upper back, triceps, biceps, middle delt, chest, and lats. So that's pretty much the shtick. And again, for each of those 10 different things, I probably could have picked 3 other options to fill the exact same slot. But the first ones that came to mind were the ones that I'm currently enjoying doing the most in my program. And so that's how I landed on them, purely subjective standpoint, but at least some objective, constraint. Just for the listener, I selected 10 options, which each basically covered some sort of major muscle group or set of muscles. And I could have confidently filled either one of those 10 buckets with probably 3 to 5 other options. But the reason that I chose the ones that I did is because I'm currently enjoying those options the most, just from a purely subjective standpoint. But I do want to reiterate what I started with there, which was that I don't think that people should ever limit themselves to, choosing 1 or 2 variations unless, for whatever example, they absolutely have to in a particular context. So that's what I would say would be my 10.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you. It's a completely arbitrary question that hopefully you'll never have to fulfill, but it's more just to see, as you mentioned, what your favorite exercises are. And it's just a weird and funny kind of way to put it in a box, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because if you ask me this question in a year, this answer might be completely different. So who knows?
Exactly. And that's the power of being able to, having the ability to change and not being stuck in a specific way of doing things, which is very powerful.
Absolutely.
So on to some of the last little questions we got for you. Who are your favorite researchers in your field?
Do you mean actual researchers or like people who are science communicators?
So let's start with a few actual researchers, and then in the kind of like influencers, we'll go to like influencers / scientific communicators next.
Okay. I would say my number one, like one of the people that I appreciate most on this front is, at least on the mechanics front, is a man named Andrew Vygotsky. He is a highly intelligent researcher in the realm of biomechanics. He's very well known for the seminal study on EMG and EMG's relationship to force production, and how EMG is not necessarily a long-term proxy for hypertrophy. So from the research perspective, I would say Andrew Vygotsky is a great name. And then from a science communication perspective, I would say that 2 major names come to mind, and these guys are absolutely huge hitters. Number 1 would probably be Eric Helms. Eric Helms is an absolute beast, has been in the game for well over a decade, and has been, I think you could definitely consider him a researcher as well. Like, he's contributed to a fair number of actual studies, and he does a lot of oversight when it comes to like students of his. So he's mentoring people in their PhD programs and those kinds of things. So I would still say that Eric is someone who has his feet equally in both cases, both science communication and the actual research stuff. So he can kind of fit into both. And then the last person I would say is Greg Nuckols. Greg Nuckols is a writer. He owns a company called Stronger by Science. And Greg does deep dives like no one else on the internet, for sure. And he's not as popular from the perspective of like subscribers and views, and he's not really on social media a ton, but Stronger by Science is his website. And I would definitely recommend that people check that out if they haven't before.
Absolutely. Both Eric Helms and Greg Nuckols were recommended by Dr. Milo Wolf, who works at Stronger by Science. He was on episode 2 on the Muscle Growth podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any favorite icons or role models
in the fitness space?
Yes, and not just out of interest, but yes, specifically in the fitness space.
At this point in time, I do not, and the reason I say that is because when I was younger, I used to put people on pedestals, and I used to look at people as role models and or idols. And the more that I got to understand myself and just the landscape of learning and intelligence, the less and less that I started to prioritize other people in a not necessarily in like a narcissistic or a self-absorbed way, but just more in the sense that like every person that you learn from and that you see talking, myself included, has strengths and has weaknesses. And I just think that every person can kind of, at least in the sense that like you're getting information out of them, can be just looked at as a human trade-off, right? This is a person who is probably really good at understanding and explaining certain things and really bad or awful at explaining other things or understanding other things. And so just that sort of like pulling back the veil or the guise of people being sort of idols or models, I think is important. But to maybe not sort of dodge the question more specifically, I would say that the person who has most influenced my understanding of this stuff is a guy whose name is Tom Purvis. I'm not sure if you've heard of Tom, but Tom has been teaching this stuff and lecturing about this stuff for, God, I think like close to 4 decades now. He's in his 60s now. He lives in Oklahoma. He does the occasional seminar now, but he's been teaching this stuff for longer than I've been, alive. And, he has taught me more than just about anyone in the exercise specific field. And a lot of the, principle-based takeaways that I have and the understanding that I have and my ability to sort of filter things through the lens that I have, I definitely owe to Tom in many ways. So Tom is someone that I would highly recommend that if people are interested in this stuff, that people check out.
So I have heard of Tom through you, through your community and your channels, and as well as your course as well. That's who I've heard of Tom. So yeah. Who would you recommend reaching out to have on this podcast, and could you put me in touch with them?
I think that you could reach out to Alec Blennis, who I actually recently talked to on my podcast. You could probably reach out to him and get him an invite, but I would be happy to do that for you. Alec is a unique voice, I think, in the space, and I think that you would have a great conversation with him.
Thank you. I'd really appreciate that. So then, closing thoughts. What advice or parting words of wisdom do you have for our listeners who are looking to embark on their own journey of muscle growth and health?
I think the main thing is, without saying anything too trite or cliche, is that you should always try to follow and prioritize what you're curious about, because I think people get the sense that there is a sort of single road to Rome when it comes to learning and understanding. And if there's anything that I've learned in the span of the last 7 years, it's that the sense of curiosity and the intuition that your curiosity breeds is probably the most important thing, not only from an acute standpoint, but also a long-term standpoint in your ability to learn information, assimilate information, and then start to form opinions of your own that are actually, unique to your own beliefs, opinions, and what you're good and you're bad at. So I would say that's the most important thing, probably. And anyone that tells you that there is a single pathway and that their pathway is their product or their program, I think should be looked at with caution. So follow your curiosity and try to get more in tune with your curiosity if you're not already.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on.
Goodbye, Gains Gurus. Thank you for listening, and see you on the next episode of TMGP.